Never in my life was I so nervous about a class. For 2 years, I had been making my way through the elementary education department here at ACU. As I worked through program, I always had this class on my radar because I knew that this is where all of my hard work would be put into practice. As I got closer to the semester, I felt questions begin to fill my head and get louder and louder each day. What if you'll hate it? What if the students don't like you? And most daunting of all, what if this isn't where you're supposed to be? And then, just like that, it was time for our very first small group lesson. I stepped into Ward Elementary terrified that this would be the day that would change everything that I had been working towards. Funnily enough, that is exactly what happened. This class changed everything because it made teaching real. All of the elements of teaching that made me nervous revealed themselves in powerful and beautiful ways that I will take with me for the rest of my teaching career. This class showed me that I do not need to be afraid. This class showed me that I am a teacher. When we began planning our small group lessons, there were 4 big ideas that we were required to build around that came directly from the Texas Teaching Standards, which act as guidelines for all teachers across the state. After becoming more familiar with these ideas, I can now use each of them to create unique, engaging, and effective math lessons for any age. The first of these teaching standards was planning. For each week, we had received a topic that our students were known to be struggling with. Because of this, the lessons that were crafted started with what the students already were familiar with, then built off of that knowledge. In Teaching Standard 1, it requires teachers to connect students' prior understanding and real-world experiences to new content and contexts. This idea lines up perfectly with the learning theory of cognitive constructivism. This theory, proposed by Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget, states that children learn content best by actively exploring new ideas and connecting them with prior knowledge. I completely agree with this thought process and believe it is imperative to bring prior knowledge into everything I do as an educator. Math should feel almost like a staircase, and in the TEKS, it is laid that way on purpose. Topics are vertically aligned from year to year so that students can look back on the previous classes and use them as a starting point for new material. For this reason, oftentimes the first thing I did after I learned the TEK I would be teaching to my 4th graders was going back a year and looking at the same TEK in 3rd grade. In Teaching Standard 1, teachers are instructed to plan instruction that is standard-driven, which is one of the reasons looking at these skills is so important. Going over the TEKs also gave me an idea of what concepts would be too advanced for the groups that I were teaching. Finding the middle ground where students felt healthily challenged was one of the main goals of my lesson planning, and I always kept it in the back of my mind. The second standard focused on knowledge of student learning. One of the most difficult parts of preparing for the very first lesson plan was this idea in particular because I had no idea how my students learned best. This made itself apparent in my first lesson where I decided to use number discs. Although I went in assuming my students would be excited to use them, this was not the case. The students were unfamiliar with the number discs and struggled heavily with them. I spent entirely too long on teaching them how to use the number discs when I could have switched the way I was teaching and moved on. For this next lesson, I decided that removing manipulatives because they were difficult would not be fair to my students. Instead, I used a smaller amount of them but still made sure there were plenty of visual work that took place in the lesson. Students used graph paper heavily so that they could visualize the concepts I was teaching while still being able to use a marker and express their thoughts on paper. Another idea this standard teaches is building a community of learners in an inclusive environment that views differences in learning and background as educational assets. For me, this looks like allowing my students to work in pairs and explain their thinking and work to each other. Giving my students the opportunity to teach their peers not only gave them the chance to deepen the understanding of those around them, but unconsciously deepen their own as well. The third standard revolved around the content knowledge that we, the teachers, possessed. One of the aspects of this standard that must be understood is knowing where students might make the most amount of mistakes. This is discussed in Standard 3, where teachers are encouraged to identify gaps in students' knowledge of subject matter and communicate with their leaders and colleagues to ensure that these gaps are adequately addressed. There was not a single lesson that I taught where all of the students immediately understood the content. This is why it is important to go over the plan that you've crafted beforehand and put yourself in the shoes of one of your students. For example, one of my students was centered around finding the area and perimeter of irregular shapes with missing side lengths. As I was going over the lesson, I began to realize that there were not nearly enough direct instructions on how to find the length of these missing sides. This was a problem because, as I saw through looking through the previous year's TEKs, my students did not have any expertise with these sorts of questions before. To avoid this potential rough patch, I included more time in my direct instruction to go over finding missing side lengths. When it came time to teach the lesson, my students had the most questions about this concept, which I had already accounted for. Because I was able to adapt my instruction and took the initiative to look for potential mistakes, I was able to give my students a lesson that ran as smoothly as possible and connected to other math concepts that they were already familiar with. The final standard that was used in my lesson plans was the presence of data-driven assessment. For my first 2 lessons, I only assessed students at the very end after they were done with their independent practice. I would walk around the table and help them if they had any questions, but I did not initiate any probing questions for them. The next lesson, I was required to come up with some sort of formative assessment. While I struggled to come up with an effective assessment and went into the lesson with low confidence, I was shocked to see just how much it impacted the learning of my students. The formative assessment I chose was all about asking students questions about their understanding that they could share with those around them, and it was easy to see that it gave them brand new perspectives on the content they were learning. The formative assessment paired with the summative assessment allowed me to evaluate my students all throughout the lesson, which gave me an abundance of data that could not have been possible if I had just assessed at the end of independent practice. This class prepared me for teaching math in the field in a way that I could not have imagined. We each came to class every day with a goal that was so much deeper than any sort of quiz or test. Our responsibility was to deepen the understanding of our students. This was such a great motivator and allowed me to put in the most care I ever have into lesson planning. In the field, there were countless mistakes that I made. The same way my students might have struggled at the beginning of a lesson, I felt nervous and like I was not good enough at the beginning of this course. However, the more time I spent with my students, the more I could feel my confidence growing. I'm still very, very new to this whole journey. Many more mistakes are to come, and that's okay. I know that I will learn from every single one of them, and I know that I will become a better teacher from them. Because of this class, I look forward to every new experience I will face as a professional educator, good or bad, because I know that I have the tools and dedication to allow students to experience math in new and exciting ways no matter what.